Okay, we're going to be letting people in right now. Just pause a second. We've got pretty much everybody in who's been waiting in the waiting room. Thank you everyone for waiting patiently. We've got pretty interesting pretty interesting presentation today for you. We're trying something a little bit different. I'm Glenda Bullock. I'm the program chair for the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor. And we are having today a roundtable discussion from some of the participants who, panelists who have contributed to this book, The Provisions of War. And we have the editor who is going to be sort of moderating, Justin Nordstrom, who is here today. But before we get started, I just want to do a couple little items of business to remind you that we are wanting to thank the Ann Arbor District Library. They are always our gracious technical host for these Zoom meetings. We ask that everyone make sure that you mute your microphone, and we will be taking questions throughout the program in chat, and at the end of the program you can raise your hand and you can ask questions in person if you would like to do that. If you would like to ask questions of the speakers a little bit later, or if an idea occurs to you and you didn't ask it during the program, in chat, we're going to be having all the participants put their email addresses so that you can follow up with them by email if you'd like. And now I'm going to just give a quick little background to the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor, which is an informal group of people who are very interested in the culture and history of food. We meet May through September. We have been meeting online since the pandemic, but as a result, we've been able to have speakers from all over the country. And today we've got people who are actually outside the country. I believe someone from England, someone in China, and perhaps even someone from India, if we get that connection. So you are, of course, always welcome to watch these programs, but we hope you will watch as a member. It's $25 a year for a membership, and it includes a subscription to Repast, which is a quarterly magazine on history, culinary history. It's a wonderful magazine. Also, please check out our website, which is culinaryhistoriansannarbor.org, and you can find information there about our upcoming programs. And with that, I think I'd like to turn it over to Justin Nordstrom. He is a professor of history at Penn State Hazleton, and he is the editor of the book Provisions of War. So thank you so much, Justin, for putting this together, and we look forward to hearing from you and your speakers.
Thank you so much, and I want to thank Glenda and the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor, as well as the District Library for all of their support. Folks, I have put in the chat the page from University of Arkansas Press. They're the publishers of this book. Included there, you'll see the full table of contents. And we have an interesting cross-section of panelists, but I wanted to say from the beginning that not all of our chapters are represented. And I also want to put my email address in the chat. I kind of feel like as part of coming to this, you have access to the authors of the book. So if there's anything that catches your eye from the table of contents, even if it's for a presenter that's not here today, I'm happy to put you in touch with the author of that particular chapter. I'm going to ask all of our presenters today to do the same thing, to share their email addresses. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end for like a question and answer session, but I know people have busy schedules, so I would hope that we could have people communicate offline, even if you're not able to talk in person. Could somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Yes?
Yes, we can see it.
All right, hold on, I'm going to try that again. Okay, so the title of the anthology is The Provisions of War, Expanding the Boundaries of Food and Conflict. And I think one of the, this is my email address, and one of the things that inspired and maybe might summarize the breadth of this collection is this quote from the anthropologist Sidney Mintz, who commented, war is probably the single most powerful instrument of dietary change in human experience. And I think what Mintz means by that is not just the impact of food on the battlefield, but even if you're not in the military and it still impacts your life, every trip to the supermarket is shaped by your nation's experience of warfare. And the subtitle of the book is Expanding the Boundaries of Food and Conflict. And the reason for that is, I mean that in two different ways. It was really important to me when I was sort of conceptualizing this and pitching it to the press that this would be a truly global anthology. And so the chapters in the book reflect every continent and also a breadth of at least 150 years. We not only have global contributors, people from all over the world writing chapters, but the coverage of the chapters doesn't just focus on familiar conflicts. We have chapters on like counterinsurgency and civil war, chapters on intentional communities, and this idea of broadening what essentially counts as war and conflict. Even those chapters, and you'll see more of this with Leslie's chapter later, that take a look at a familiar conflict like the American Civil War or World War II, they look at it from international perspectives. And so that was a major focus of the anthology, looking at a global description of warfare. The other aspect of expanding boundaries has to do with chronology. So often descriptions of warfare start with the very first battle and they end with some sort of peace treaty or armistice. And that, I think, presents an overly simplistic picture, especially when you're looking at something as broad as food. We know, of course, that deprivation and starvation during war don't magically end when the last bullet is fired. So chapters in this anthology take a look at the role of war in food in pre-war planning, or they look at the lingering effect of malnutrition and starvation on generations even after the war is over. So that aspect of the chronology, expanding the boundaries chronologically, was also really important. The chapters here run from roughly the 1840s until the end of the Cold War at the end of the 20th century. And finally, one other aspect of the anthology, one other way to perhaps introduce the themes that you're going to be hearing about today, is this one of paradox. I think that it's really important to understand the role that food and the absence of food both play in how nations think about and how individuals experience warfare. So I've got my last three slides are just to emphasize that idea of paradox and contradiction. These are from the same time and place. They're all from the US Food Administration during World War I, so roughly 100 years ago. And they're all produced by the same government agency. This is the US Food Administration that's headed in 1917 by future President Herbert Hoover. And this picture emphasizes the theme of kind of nightmarish or apocalyptic feelings around food and warfare. You can see in the foreground, there's a woman cradling a dying child, and in her lap is an empty food bowl. And the implication here, of course, is that her son is starved to death. And you see the man standing next to her with a clenched fist. He's holding a burning torch, and he's staring off into this gleaming white city in the background, as if he's going to destroy it. So filled with rage that he's going to destroy the city. And the captions, I think, tell the story here. A quote from Woodrow Wilson saying, "Hunger breeds madness, and America's food must save the world." And so there's an almost crusading mentality that America has to provide food to war-torn Europe to prevent this kind of senseless destruction. On the other end of the spectrum, this is a sort of a happy and vibrant picture. You see the arcing rainbow there, an image of the Statue of Liberty. The immigrants coming to America are told to help their new country, not by necessarily enlisting, but by saving food. And the message here, food will win the war. This poster was depicted in countless languages. I've seen it in the archives in Italian and in Greek, and here it is in Yiddish. These pictures emphasize this idea of contrast. And I think you're going to see some more of that in our upcoming speakers, this idea of contrasting themes of tension or adversity, and on the other hand, sort of this optimistic imagery. And both of those can exist at the same time, place. So with that, as a very brief overview, I want to invite our first speaker. This is Jing. Jing, could you introduce yourself? I'm going to stop screen sharing here, and I'll turn the floor over to you, and I'll be moderating the chat to see if there's any questions that we could bring up maybe at the end.
Great, thank you, Justin. So I'm gonna put down my email address first in the chat. Everybody see it? Okay. Thank you everyone for joining our talk, and many thanks to Justin and Glenda and Leslie to put all this roundtable together. And it's very nice to finally see not all the contributors, but few of the contributors ever since the publication of our book. So my name is Suen, and I'm currently a PhD candidate in modern Japanese history at University of Pennsylvania. So my research examines the kind of Japanese society, economy, and politics and warfare through the lens of food and nutrition. And my current dissertation research project examines the making of dietary standard in modern Japan and its impact on the making of political economy of food in Japan from 1880s to 1945. So today I want to introduce briefly my chapter in this book, which is titled Hungry Empire, Manchuria and the Failed Food Autarky in Imperial Japan, 1931 to 41. Actually, similar to many of our contributors' chapters in the book, it discusses how the food waste might impact the making and the management of an empire, and from the perspective of agriculture and military policies. So in this specific case of Japan, I described, as Justin has mentioned, a paradox. It discusses how the anxiety over and the attempt to avoid hunger in Japan in the 1930s and 40s actually caused food shortage and crisis in the empire. So in chronological order, I want to introduce the content of my chapter. So first, I argue that the Japanese governing elites, both civilian and military, has formed a very strong fixation with the idea of achieving food autarky or self-sufficiency in their food supply in the empire, especially their people's like staple food, rice. So this kind of fixation has fueled a large-scale agricultural immigration in the 1930s to this place called Manchuria, which is now currently the northeastern part of China. So the Japanese people had imagined this place as a land of hope and harvest, where the land is very fertile and they can grow whatever they want. So in the 1930s, under the government support, thousands of Japanese farmers immigrated to this land and hoping to cultivate more rice for the empire. And it was hoped that in this way, Manchuria could become another big supplier of stable food, rice, for the Japanese people. But this move to Manchuria to a great extent turned out to be very fatal to this to Japan, since more and more Japanese people moved to Manchuria. The eating habits in Manchuria also began to change. So first, Japanese people who moved there basically brought over their eating habit, which is eating rice almost 3 meals a day. At the same time, under the influence of these immigrants, the local people in Manchuria also began to change their diet habit. So they also began to eat more rice. Because of this change of eating habits in Manchuria, the demand for rice began to increase quite dramatically in Manchuria. But at the same time, it turned out that the land was not that fertile in Manchuria, and it took way longer than the elites expected to cultivate enough rice in Manchuria. So as a result, Manchuria actually became a consumer of rice in the Japanese Empire instead of a supplier. And the people there relied heavily on the rice import from actually mainland Japan, Korea, and also India and Hong Kong and other foreign countries. So with all this foreign support, the whole food supply system of the Japanese Empire is still stable. But when the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1937, Manchuria's dependence on this supply of rice, foreign supply of rice, led to the collapse of the Japanese inner empire food supply system. And because they no longer are able to guarantee rice imported from foreign countries like US, Canada, Australia, and China, Manchuria became more and more dependent on mainland Japan to supply their stable food rice. And this made the whole empire more hungry for stable food rice. And the situation became even worse in 1939, 2 years after the war broke out, and when the bad harvest happened in Korea and Taiwan, the two main rice supplier in the empire. So as a result, the Japanese government began to form plans to secure food supply for the empire. And they came up with this plan to maybe move it south, which is basically a military move to Southeast Asia to guarantee the rice supply there. So in 1941, well, most people know that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and began the war with US. It's actually about the same time they also attacked Southeast Asia and took over the land there and also mostly the farmland there. So this move to South further expanded the Japanese empire to Southeast Asia, but it also dragged itself into a bigger war, which eventually they lost because they are fighting like basically a war that they cannot afford. So this is basically the content of my my article. Thanks for your listening, and I look forward to your questions and feedback. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jing. I appreciate it. Next up, we've got Evan Sullivan.
Hello. Let me just put my my email address in here for you. I do want to preface saying I have a newborn at home, so if you hear a baby in the background, that's what it is. So I'm going to screen share. I have an image that I'll have us look at while we're looking through or while I'm talking about my chapter. Thanks again to Justin Nordstrom and to the other contributors for their work. This was really, really interesting seeing this all come together. And it, of course, with any book, takes a little while for things to come to publication, and it was really, really nice being a part of this. I'm a history instructor from Queensbury, New York. I teach at SUNY Ardondack. I have a PhD in history from the University at Albany in New York, where I focused on war, disabled veterans, and the census in World War I. And currently I'm writing a book on blinded veterans. My chapter in this anthology deals with the role that food consumption and taste played in disabled American soldiers' experiences in post-war hospitals. Much has been written on World War I American rehabilitation. Scholars have also explored the critical roles food played in World War I, but significantly less attention has been given to soldiers' eating experiences in post-war hospitals. By examining sanitary reports, patient complaints, and other institutional records, my chapter explored the ways soldiers and hospital administrators negotiated eating experiences in hospital mess halls. Ultimately, my chapter argues that in some cases, the sense of taste gave disabled soldiers a sense of control over their lives while in U.S. Army hospitals. While at the same time, soldiers with more severe wounds or illnesses found themselves marginalized by the realities of food systems in hospitals. Both situations suggest that food consumption left much to be desired, and that soldier patients actively held the state accountable for standards of care. So post-war hospitals served as sites where the U.S. Army practiced food conservation. Walter Reed, Fort McHenry, and Fort Des Moines all had agricultural vocational training programs for wounded veterans. Fort Des Moines, for example, taught courses in farming, in tractor mechanics, and chicken raising. Sometimes the produce or stock grown in the farm programs fed the hospital population. One Baltimore hospital, for example, had regular chicken dinners. Agricultural training programs provided real vocational support for most veterans, while also serving an important function in food conservation. Disabled soldiers, therefore, signified their successful rehabilitation by training for a vocation, in this case, agriculture, and by helping their fellow soldier patients eat. When hospitals were not using patient-grown food, administrative officials secured meat, vegetables, and other staples through farms near hospitals. Sergeant Isaac Anderson, for example, accused General Hospital number 11 in Cape May, New Jersey, of serving poor quality food. Anderson was sent there after coming down with rheumatism in France. He was unhappy with his experiences in Cape May, claiming to have been detained longer than necessary. He also argued that the sanitary conditions there were, quote, far from satisfactory, and that he was being half-fed at times with tainted meat. The Inspector General's investigation into Anderson's claims is revealing. They found that sanitary conditions were indeed far from satisfactory. The plumbing was old, and on account of leakage, there were pools of water on the floor in many places. And the leaky and unsanitary ice boxes at the hospital contributed to the puddles of water that collected on the floors. Soldiers also criticized the situation at Fort McHenry in Baltimore. One soldier there complained that the hot dogs were, quote, a trifle old, the coffee was weak, and the string beans we had looked as though they were cooked in curdled milk. He and his fellow comrades joked about the milk. Quote, they say that the way the milk is made is to take a pitcher of water and put a dime on the bottom. Then they pour the milk into the water. As soon as the dime can't be seen, it is called milk, end quote. Upon subsequent investigations, the mess officer explained that the condensed milk did consist of equal parts water and milk until the hospital switched to fresh milk shortly after the soldiers' complaint. These protests were representative of broader issues in post-war hospitals. At the hospital at Camp Dix in New Jersey, food was unappetizing, with almost universal complaint from patients, as one sanitary report read. That same report made clear that meals that arrived for ward patients or patients who couldn't go to the mess halls were also insufficient and sometimes burnt. The hospital at Lakewood, New Jersey, served tainted fish and had dilapidated equipment that was in desperate need of repair. At a general hospital in New York City, they served tainted hamburger steak to patients. And inspectors found the butter at Otisville, New York's hospital for tuberculosis patients, quote, rancid and unfit for serving. Regardless of which hospital they ended up at, disabled American soldiers of World War I were overwhelmingly dissatisfied with their dining experiences. And so why was this the case? One reason, as I show in the chapter, was that American hospitals didn't effectively use their staff. Women, for example, were highly trained dietitians and worked alongside the US military. They served overseas. Many had university educations, but they were significantly underemployed in stateside hospitals. Instead, hospital administrations employed cooks who lacked experience, most of whom were men, and did not utilize the expertise of women dietitians, right? And so this proved medically problematic for some soldiers. Some patients who required special light diets to heal from various illnesses, for example, received full diets that were far too heavy. Another reason for the inadequate food was a general lack of equipment. Soldiers ate on chipped, greasy, and usually poorly washed dishware, which proved particularly problematic during the influenza pandemic, when disease spread quickly in areas of close confinement, such as hospitals and mess kitchens. The ways hospital food was served also generated concern. So some hospitals prohibited patients from getting food until they were summoned. Part of the reasoning for this was to avoid loud rattling and talking in these mess halls that would prove problematic for sick and traumatized soldiers. But there was usually a lack of coherent system for dispatching patients to mess halls. And according to one report from a hospital in Richmond, Virginia, this resulted in a, quote, staggering to breakfast and a large number of patients in their pajamas waiting in line outside the mess hall for a chance to get inside for breakfast. So oftentimes this led to long waits and confusion. For soldiers who could not travel to the mess halls, those who were too sick or wounded to go to the mess halls, they ate in the wards, in their beds, and ward service was haphazard. Hospital kitchens had food carts for transportation, but these didn't always work properly. And finally, as you notice in this picture, all the soldiers in this mess hall were white. This is from Walter Reed, I believe. Even if hospitals did not have strict policies of segregation, many had more informal segregated dining facilities. At a blind veteran hospital in Baltimore, for example, Black veterans were segregated into separate eating rooms. One veteran protested and the hospital suggested that he find meals in the city of Baltimore instead, right? And so race dictated to what extent disabled veterans had the social and political capital to influence their food experiences. And so through this process, we see disabled veterans writing to administration to get things changed. And so these food histories show us the extent to which some soldiers had more ability to influence change and those who were more marginalized in hospitals than others. All right, thank you.
Thanks so much, Evan. Next up, we have Caroline McLean.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. I've just put my email address in the window, and I'm sharing my PowerPoint with you now. I'm Caroline McLean. I'm a professor of the religions of South Asia at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania. My chapter in the Provisions of War was chapter 3, titled Food and Anti-Colonialism at Gandhi's Intentional Communities in South Africa and India. Mahatma Gandhi was, of course, a lawyer, a politician, and an activist, but he was also a back-to-the-land farmer who established 4 intentional communities where Indians and Europeans lived and labored together, working jointly to confront colonial injustices and create a counterworld to the colonialist and capitalist status quo. My larger research project is a study of these 4 intentional communities that were established by Gandhi: Phoenix Settlement and Tolstoy Farm in South Africa, and Sabarmati Ashram and Sevagam Ashram in India. Experiments with food were central to the life of these communities, and these experiments had important implications for how Gandhi would politically engage the British colonial government to fight for Indian civil rights and eventually Indian independence. My chapter in this volume takes sugar and salt as its 2 case studies. So with my few minutes today, I thought I would give you a very quick overview of these 2 case studies: sugar in South Africa and salt in India. Gandhi arrived in South Africa in 1893 as a young lawyer, and he would ultimately spend 21 years there. Just a few months after his arrival in South Africa, he was approached by a young man from South India named Balasundaram, who worked as an indentured laborer on a sugar plantation. And Balasundaram asked Gandhi for legal aid after he had been badly beaten by his white employer. Gandhi was able to transfer Balasundaram's contract, his indenture contract, to another master. And thereafter, Gandhi had a stream of indentured laborers from the sugar plantations in his office. The average annual production of sugar in Natal Colony, South Africa, rose from 500 tons in the 1850s to an excess of 20,000 tons by the 1890s as a result of the growth of Indian indentured labor. Although these indentured laborers helped to make white Europeans in South Africa quite wealthy, they faced demeaning and often abusive treatment. Gandhi founded his first intentional community, Phoenix Settlement, in 1904 on farmland outside Durban. There, Gandhi and a cohort of like-minded friends from Indian and European heritages sought to build a simple, self-sufficient, and equitable life together. Gandhi was strict in specifying the dietary rules of the settlement. Gandhi insisted that beyond a vegetarian diet, all residents should consume only a minimal amount of sugar and no coffee, tea, or cocoa, as all of these agricultural products were tied to colonialist and capitalist systems of injustice that relied upon immoral labor practices, which Gandhi deemed akin to slavery. Gandhi founded his second intentional community, Tolstoy Farm, outside Johannesburg in 1910. This was a 1,000-acre farm. And at this time, Gandhi began to speak out and encourage all Indians throughout South Africa, not just those living with him, to refrain from consuming sugar, tea, coffee, and cocoa. And he began to publicly campaign for an end to indentured labor. From Tolstoy Farm, Gandhi gave speeches, wrote essays, and organized a movement to end indentured labor, declaring that sugar that was made with the blood of indentured laborers should not be used to gratify anyone's palate. In the end, Gandhi prevailed. The government of India prohibited indenture from India to Natal Colony, South Africa in 1911. It was during his 21 years in South Africa that Gandhi began to connect the dots between food and empire. In India, Gandhi turned his attention to salt. He founded his third intentional community, Sabarmati Ashram, in 1915 on the banks of the Sabarmati River outside Ahmedabad. At its founding, Gandhi declared that the mission of the settlement was the service of the country and universal well-being. He enumerated 11 rules or observances as essential for fulfilling this mission, and one of them was control of the palate. Gandhi emphasized that control of the palate was essential for living a simple, disciplined, and nonviolent life. He began to experiment with minimizing his own salt intake and asked his fellow residents at Sabarmati Ashram to do so as well. This was not only to improve their health, and exercise self-discipline, but also because Gandhi was growing ever more aware of the politics of salt. Given the poverty and hunger of the masses in India, Gandhi was especially angered by the salt tax. The India Salt Act of 1882 made the collection and manufacture of salt a monopoly of the British government. Salt, Gandhi argued, was a basic need, as necessary as water and air. To monopolize and tax it was an unjust law that served colonialism and capitalism at the expense of India's masses. So once again, Gandhi began by minimizing the consumption of this substance in his own diet and then in the meals served at his intentional communities. Eventually, Gandhi waged a nonviolent anti-colonial battle that revolved around salt, beginning with the famous Salt March of 1930. On March 12, 1930, Gandhi and 78 residents from Sabarmati Ashram began a march to the coast of Gujarat. On April 6th, Gandhi and his fellow marchers arrived at the coast, where they broke the Salt Act simply by collecting natural sea salt. This was the start of a nationwide civil resistance campaign. In total, over 80,000 Indians were arrested throughout the country during the Salt Satyagraha, including Gandhi. The Salt March played a significant role in mobilizing the people of India to participate in the ongoing struggle for independence. Gandhi is most famously remembered as a politician and a lawyer, but he was also a tiller of the soil, a caretaker of goats, a proud salt thief, and founder of multiple back to the land utopian farming communities. These characteristics were not only central to his identity, they were central to this method for fighting against colonial oppression. The food experimentation that took place at his intentional communities began with his own diet, extended into the residential communities, and then evolved into full-blown struggles for Indian civil rights and independence from colonial rule. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next is Leslie.
Thank you so much, Justin. And I'm going to go ahead and start by sharing my email here as well. And then I am going to share my screen. And can you see that? I will go ahead and get started.
Leslie, I'm not seeing it.
You're not seeing it? Okay, usually this works. Okay, I'm not sure why this is not showing up on here. So I might go ahead and skip my graphics for the moment. I don't know why that is not showing up here. Can you see that now?
No. Still no, but you can go ahead and press on, and maybe during our Q&A we could get the pictures.
Yeah,
I can see it.
You can see that? Well, I'll go ahead. I can do it without it at the moment. You know, I am a curator at the History Center in Pittsburgh at the Senator John Heinz History Center. My topic is really one that, in contrast to some of the others in the book, is more of an overview, but it starts from a very local perspective. There is a collection in the Heinz History Center related to the story of a gentleman whose name was Ray Spreigel. And there's this great photo, and I hope I can share it with you at the end here, where he is standing here with a hunk of meat on his shoulder. And in fact, he's posing as an illegal meat dealer from Cleveland, Ohio. And the collection in the History Center is really this hyper-local collection that documents Mr. Ray Spreigel's efforts to blow open what he perceives as this badly hidden secret, a major black market meat ring in Pittsburgh. And I will admit that as a local curator, in many respects, that's where that story would stay. Mr. Spreigel, it results in a week-long worth of headlines. There are congressional committees, and it's focused on this story of, oh my gosh, look how horrible this situation is in Pittsburgh. But, and I think this is one of the real values of Justin's efforts with this book, If you pull back from that moment regarding Ray Spreigel and the situation in Pittsburgh in the spring of 1945, most specifically in March and April 1945, you realize that in the international press regarding the battle back and forth between Australia, Canada, and to a lesser extent, Great Britain as sort of their exemplar and the example that everybody is looking towards, and the country that they're trying to supply with food, that there's this larger international debate going on. And in my chapter, which is titled, "We Don't Need Red Tape, We Need Red Meat," what I'm really doing is trying to take a 30,000-foot view of looking at this situation, not from the perspective of one community, but in the way that the allies, especially the allies of the British Commonwealth nations versus the United States, are balancing this issue back and forth. And you realize that, and how many of us today have not kind of gained a new sense of reality in terms of supply chain issues, especially between Canada and the United States, that throughout World War II, from the beginning to the end of the conflict, and even extending past that, between Canada, Australia, and the United States, there was this constant balancing act, measuring the needs and desires, frankly, of their local populations against the need to supply food to Great Britain and the need to supply the Allied armies. And so my chapter is really attempting to do something that I have to say, until a few years ago, probably wouldn't really have been possible, using a greater number of digitized resources and more archives that are opening what were once classified documents and making them accessible to researchers, to look at and try and identify some commonalities in the experiences of fighting the black market meat scourge in these nations. What are some common strains that emerge, and what are potentially topics for future, more in-depth research? And to be honest, the situation with black market meat was never, excluding Great Britain, was never really a matter of need for these nations. You know, we're talking red meat here, steaks, tenderloin, chops. All of these nations had multiple alternate sources of proteins. All of them, from the beginning to the end of the war, almost unceasingly stressed strategies for meat extending recipes, ways to use other things. There were certainly kinds of meat that were not rationed, and thus they were always available. But all of them faced an intractable process and problem with black market meat because it was something that people desired. Witness, for example, a city like Pittsburgh, where meat was seen as a highly symbolic food source. It was a symbol of virility. It was a symbol of what industrial workers needed. And so my chapter looks at a couple of big commonalities that emerge, a few differences, and then suggests some areas for future research. For example, one of the things that I really explore is this question of why was there such an urgency specifically over the fight against black market meat? You know, if you'd asked housewives in the US, they might have said that sugar was actually the material that they missed the most, but meat was the one that they struggled with the most. And part of this has to do with the fact that the question of black market meat, who could get it, who couldn't, where it was available, where it wasn't available, really became seen as a potentially dangerous source of social instability. It widened gaps between populations in the civilian populations, when this is the very moment when governments need the people on the home front to pull together. Black market meat becomes an issue of rural versus urban areas. It is seen as a problem of cities. It is seen as a problem in some cases of the inner city. And within that, also at times, it focuses on this question of certain ethnic or cultural populations. For example, rumors that emerge at more than one case in New York City saying that, well, the black market meat is emerging from kosher slaughterhouses, or the frustrations in this public reputation that those French-speaking residents of Montreal gain, that they are so much less willing to follow the legal ramifications of the system than, say, English-speaking Canada. So there's a fear of social disunity. At the same time, you see that a distinct difference arises in the way that some of this black market meat situation is perceived in the British Commonwealth nations, Australia and Canada, versus the United States, where very early on in the process, they seem to hark back to the last time that Americans responded to the federal government's effort to regulate or ban their access to a food source. And thinking back to your program with the culinary historians of a few weeks ago, prohibition. So in the US, what you see very early on is that they begin to call the black marketeers meat leggers. There are these headlines about, oh my gosh, Al Capone's gang is back in operation. And while the headlines are disparaging, at the same time, there's a little bit of excitement that you find in them. It's as if people are almost jazzed that this is going on in the midst of the larger situation of the war. Again, a reminder that while these nations are allies, especially within the US presentation of homefront histories in public history, we tend to look upon these things as being very unified. It's a really crucial reminder that they were not always so. Another thing, and a part of my chapter really focuses on media portrayals of this fight, both through newspaper and then in really the second half of the chapter, looking at film as a means. All of these nations, Great Britain, Australia, Canada, they all used films as a means to convey to the public this fight. Some of them are public informational films, anti-Black marketing films. In the US, as part of this sort of lighter attitude they have, some of it, frankly, becomes humorous films. And one of the examples that I mentioned is, and I can only describe it as a dumb comedy, because it is a dumb comedy, a film starring Wallace Beery called Rationing from 1944, where he takes on this character of the bumbling butcher who kind of stumbles into a black market meat ring. It's very haphazard. He's sort of almost a slapstick comedy figure. He is rescued by his nemesis, the head of the ration board, a woman. This is true. There are radio programs featuring Fibber McGee and Molly, where again, Fibber McGee buys tainted meat and then everybody gets sick and it's solved by Molly. This is a distinct contrast to, for example, the film that is really the most important example of anti-Black market efforts, Great Britain's film Partners in Crime, where the woman who successfully buys Black market meat from a butcher, and she convinces him to do this, is portrayed not just as culpable in this, but truly as a criminal. And it points out the other thing that is really a theme that emerges in my chapter, that while the Black market network is entirely a creation of men in terms of the ranchers, the butchers, the suppliers, the shippers, from the beginning to end, it's women on whom the onus falls to legally supply a righteous food source for the table. And so these films like Black Marketing that make the woman out to be the criminal if she participates in the system are sending a larger message. And I have to say, this is an interesting chapter because ultimately there is no one solution. In fact, Black market issues lasted well after World War II. For some countries like Canada and Australia, in fact, their worst Black market episodes happened after the end of the war, when citizens, completely fed up with living under these guidelines, finally decided they had enough, reminiscent of situations today. But the chapter really hopes to open up lines for further discussion and further research. And as with my example in the History Center of one small local collection, what I'm hoping is that it helps kind of underline the value of those collections, maybe bring up a few more in the process. I'd love to hear of things in other collections and really encourage more research on an under-researched avenue of this topic for future projects. And that is the end of my chapter talk.
Great, thank you so much, Leslie. Our last presenter, Bryce Evans.
Well, good evening, everybody, and hello from England. It's way past my bedtime, I have to say. The weather is predictably bad here, but I want to take you to some sunnier climes. I want to take you to Peru. So hopefully I can share my screen here. Maybe somebody could just indicate if you can see my screen. Yep, Grace. Okay. So yeah, I want to take you back to the 80s and 90s in Peru, and to a quite tragic episode really in that country's history, but also I think an inspiring one. And Peru, as you all know, is in Western South America, home to about 33 million people. But in the 80s, 90s, and to a lesser extent the early noughties, went through a very bloody civil war. And since independence, really, like a lot of these Latin American countries, there has unfortunately been issues with corruption, poverty, social division, and also a couple of themes I want to touch on today, and that is machismo and the place of women within society. So a few contexts to just establish, first of all. After World War II, Peru goes through an experience of mass internal migration from the very poor Andean regions, essentially peasant populations, and I don't mean that as a pejorative, moving to Lima. And Lima, as the capital of the country, is about 500,000 people in 1940. But at the time of speaking now, it's about 11, 12 million people. So you can appreciate how, like a lot of capital cities in the developing world, it just balloons. And of course, people come looking for work, etc. But there's a lot of economic problems, a lot of poverty, a lot of new communities spring up. It's slum communities, essentially. We're lacking basic amenities, and it falls to the women in these communities, some very brave women in these communities, to feed people, essentially. So why is feeding people so controversial? Well, I think it relates to the broader theme, which is explored in the volume, on commensality. That's social eating. The anthropologists call it commensality, social eating in wartime. And I've written extensively on this theme, but I've focused really on Europe. I've got a new book coming out soon on social eating in Britain in World War II. But the point from the European experience of social eating in wartime, you see it in nearly every state. You see it in Britain in the war, you see it in the fascist countries, Italy, Germany, you see it in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union really trumps it as a sort of means of liberating women from capitalist kitchen slavery. But one thing to consider is that it's always politically contested, social eating in a wartime experience, in a time of restricted supplies, in a time of price inflation a lot of the time. Social eating becomes a really, really contested political site. And that is the case in Peru in the 80s and 90s, because Peru, although Peru doesn't go through a total war, like many other countries during World War II, it does go through a very nasty civil war, which claims the life of about 80,000 people in the 80s and 90s. And that civil war is associated with this group, the Shining Path, or Sendero Luminoso, who are a particularly dogged bunch of Maoists who really want to overthrow the sort of imperial shackles as they see it in Peru, expel sort of American finance and American presence through American NGOs and even through the United Nations, etc. They're also opposed to traditional power brokers in the country like the Catholic Church. And they really, although they're led by a bunch of white middle-class Maoist university professors, they really proclaim it their mission to liberate the indigenous people. So again, one of the themes in Peru is it remains a very racist country, really, dominated by white elites. And where if you are, indigenous or black, you are essentially a member of the underclass. So the Maoist Sendero Luminoso produced a lot of propaganda like this, led by this guy depicted in the sun here. This is all very kind of reminiscent of North Korean stuff, isn't it? Abimael Guzman, who's a university professor. And as the picture shows, he wants the sort of peasants from the interior to take the cities and to sort of carry out the Marxist-Leninist Maoist revolution. And as the insurgency goes on, it becomes a very bitter war between these very violent Maoist guerrillas, but also the state, the government in Peru responds with their own form of sort of commando units, guerrilla units. So it becomes a very, very nasty civil war indeed. And although it's fought with the ostensible aim of liberating the indigenous people, the poor people, they're often the victims. And a lot of the victims are women who are running these comedores populares, popular dining rooms, so social eating spaces, and they're non-political spaces. And they're run just to feed these communities because people need to be fed, kids need to be fed. There's an awful lot of malnourishment at the time. The state is really struggling. You have a presidency in the early 90s, which pursues sort of really counterproductive populist left measures. The economy is falling apart. And really the people who are keeping people fed are, yes, the Catholic Church, etc., but also these women who are running their own communal feeding schemes, their social eating schemes. And one of the very brave and inspirational women is this woman, Maria Elena Mayano. And I want to tell you her very sad story because, like I say, social eating in wartime, whether it's a civil conflict or a total war, it's always very politically contested. The state's vision at the time, by the time we get to the mid to late 90s, the Peruvian state is being run by a Peruvian Japanese man called Alberto Fujimori. And his approach to politics, to economics is sort of very, very stridently neoliberal, sort of extreme sort of Reaganite, basically. He wants to sort of privatize everything. And so the state is targeting these social eating schemes run by these women who are just serving rice and beans to people. And the state is saying you should privatize, you should become private restaurants. At the same time, the guerrillas view these women feeding people as not revolutionary enough. They don't want them to be communal kitchens. They want them to be revolutionary centers of agitation and propaganda. So really these women are caught in the middle and they can't win. And all they're trying to do is feed people against a drastic backdrop of hyperinflation and malnutrition. And this wonderful woman, Maria Elena Mayano, is one of the leaders of the women's movement in Lima at this time. And of course, that's I wish I had a bit more time. That's a broader context in Latin America. The struggle goes on today with the Ni Una Menos campaign, against machismo, against for women's rights and against gendered violence. And Maria Elena Mayano, who's the organizer of these Comedores Populares in Lima, she's a pioneer of social eating. She is horrifically a victim of gendered violence when the Maoists, Sendero Luminoso, viewing her as ameliorating the capitalist state as they see it, as not being revolutionary enough, at a community barbecue where cheap food is being offered, cheap nutritious food, they abduct her and they blow up her body in the most horrific way possible, inserting explosives into her vagina. And it's typical really of how the women in these community kitchens find themselves in the firing line, and all they're trying to do is feed people. But they're trying to, and the chapter discusses how they're negotiating a very fine line between what the state wants and what this very violent Maoist insurgency wants. I'll just finish up with a quick picture here. I visited a lot of these kitchens. I love them across Peru. They're cheap. The food's great. It's big one-pot cooking. It's fantastically inspirational stuff. And slowly, as the chapter discusses, they've won recognition from the state, and they've won actually the state actually providing them with some of the basic amenities, rice, etc., cooking oil, which they need to carry out these things. At the same time, they remain fiercely independent of the state, and again have to negotiate this sort of political status, which is neither membership of the sort of Maoist insurgency, which is still rumbling on in some parts of Peru, or the sort of state authoritarian vision, which is so typical of Latin America, sadly, in this period. But they maintain an independent status. They feed people, and they feed people well. They keep people alive at a time of great civil strife and horror, really, in terms of the violence of this very bloody civil war. And they just inspire me greatly. And it's a non-conventional wartime context for this chapter, but it's a struggle which continues to this day. So thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Bryce. If I could invite all of the panelists that are still here to come on screen, and we would be thrilled to answer questions. Glenda tells me that we have a bit of time for Q&A at the end. I saw some good comments in the chat. Thanks to those of you that chimed in. Any other comments for the panel?
Yeah, that's fast.
Wonderful. Hey, Betty, I see that you turned your camera on. Did you have a question?
She's muted.
I see. Yeah, we can't hear you. Maybe she just accidentally turned the camera on. Let's see.
Oh my God. I have a question for Bryce as to how these communal kitchens are funded.
That's a very good question. In the bleak days of the 1980s, they're literally funded as bottom-up community institutions running themselves. The prices are capped, so they're not making huge profits, but they're just sustainable communities on their own. These days, through a very long process of trying to get the central state to recognize their autonomy, but at the same time not trying to, it's a very delicate balance, not trying to sort of toe the state's line. They have now, like I mentioned, some central funding and some sort of food aid that goes towards them in the form of, like I mentioned, rice and cooking oil, etc. But to all intents and purposes, they're bottom-up, self-sustaining, female-run ventures. You know, they're not there to turn over huge profits. They're there to sustain communities. So really, they fund and organize themselves, and that's really one of the reasons why I find them so inspiring.
I just want to mention, if anyone wants to raise their hand, we can call on them and you can ask a question in person. Looks like Larry Orr might have a question or comment.
Yes, thank you very much. In discussions like this, and maybe you covered this already, I had to step out for a little bit, but did anyone mention the difference between brown rice and white rice, polished, denutrination, whatever the word is? As we talk about world hunger and hunger in wartime, and rice being such a big part of our diets generally, how about the difference between the white rice and brown rice? Does that enter into it?
That's a great question. I wish that Jing was still on. I'm sure she'd have some comments. Bryce, since you mentioned that specifically in the Peruvian context, do you want to take care of this one?
I'm afraid I'm not terribly qualified on this one. Beyond, of course, you know, brown rice being much better for your health than white rice, and but I mean, I suppose more generally, as a food historian, it's something which you look throughout history in the role of food in revolutions, and the mob is always agitating for white bread and white rice, paradoxically, it being worse for their health. But it's a sort of deep set thing, isn't it, in terms of this notion of purity and freshness being associated with the white, which we're only just overcoming, I suppose, in today's modern dietary understanding and all the rest. But I'm afraid I can't really talk to this theme much more than that. Aside from saying, of course, in Peru, these places, it's rice and beans. That's the basic meal they're cooking. But I don't know if anyone else could elaborate on that.
I can answer a little bit of Mari Barnes' question. There are a number of sources for different nations that I can send you if you want to send me something to my email. Some of it is in articles. It's in a couple of theses that are out there now. And then as well, a lot of my work, frankly, has been done through sources like newspapers.com, which I know it sounds very odd, but for a lot of local history sources, it's made it much, much more possible to research across chronological time periods and geographical time periods. It's changing the study of subjects like temperance, where people are finding new discoveries because rather than going from archives to archives and wading through microfilm after microfilm, they're finding it now, but it means that there aren't a lot of written sources out there yet. There are a couple, though, that I'd be happy to share with you. If you see my email there, send me a note via email and I'll send you a couple that are specific to your interests.
All right, I'm responding to a few comments in the chat, but I guess, Glenda, did you want to hop back on and say anything as we kind of wrap up?
Oh, sure. Let me turn my camera back on here. Yeah, I would first, of course, like to really thank all of the participants. This has been fascinating and quite a range, all within a certain topic. So I really want to thank everyone for giving us your time and your presentations, and to remind people that you can check our website for upcoming programs. That next month we have a program which is as I like to say, still on a somewhat bellicose theme, which is victory gardens, and how, according to our speaker, Judith Sumner, who is an ethnobotanist, how plants played a major role in winning World War II. And that's on March 20th, so mark your calendars. And a couple more programs coming up in the months to come. We have a program on the meatpacking district in New York City. The presenter is a 5th generation member of a family of pioneering butchers. And then in May, I'm very excited to say that we have Laura Shapiro, the author, who is going to be doing a presentation on her book, What She Ate. And 6 women that she has chosen through history to tell their stories through what they ate. A wide range, not everyone, but a range from Eva Braun to Helen Gurley Brown. So quite a span. And that is all I need to say. Thanks to the Ann Arbor District Library again, as always, for hosting us and doing a wonderful job of managing all of our speakers today. So I think it was a great success and really appreciate this. A couple of people have asked about capturing the email addresses of folks, and we can certainly do that. So if anyone wants to reach out to us at our email address, we can share, if you didn't have a chance to copy down folks' email addresses, if you want to follow up with any of our speakers. Thank you, Justin, for coming to us.
Of course, thanks, Elena. Bye, everyone.
All right, thank you so much. Bye-bye.